My name is Eric Stellwagen, and I will be demonstrating Forecast Pro XE today. So why don't we get started? Before I actually jump into the program, I'd like to give you just a little bit of background on Business Forecast Systems, the company that created Forecast Pro. We've been around a while. We started the firm in 1986, and the first version of Forecast Pro came out in 1987. Forecast Pro is a very popular package at this point. We've got over 35,000 users, and we really are used around the globe. We are available in many different languages. We've been localized to all the languages on the screen. And in addition to doing forecasting software, we also offer services such as training on the software, consulting services in the area of business forecasting, and we can also run workshops and webinars in the area of statistical forecasting. The Forecast Pro product line actually has 3 different products. Our emphasis today is going to be on Forecast Pro XE, but there are 2 other versions, Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track, and the 3 versions are really designed to satisfy different forecasting needs. Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track are larger scale solutions, and they offer a lot more functionality in areas such as collaborative forecasting, forecast management, exception reporting, tracking forecast accuracy, and they're also designed to integrate with other systems like ERP systems or supply chain execution systems. So those products are available, and if you want to learn more about them, you can visit our website or download the demo pack or call us and we'll demonstrate them for you. But today's emphasis and today's demonstration is Forecast Pro XE. So that's what we'll be concentrating on. So some basic product capabilities. What is Forecast Pro XE all about? Well, first and foremost, it's used to create accurate, statistically based forecasts using things like the demand for the items being forecasted and potentially other information like maybe promotional schedules or explanatory variables. But again, the main purpose of Forecast Pro XE is to create accurate, statistically based forecasts from data. You can create forecasts automatically using something we call the expert system. So if we're just going to base the forecast on the past history, Forecast Pro is very good at automatically determining a time series method to generate the forecast and can do so completely automatically without any need to have a background in statistics and forecasting. On the other hand, it also contains a lot of advanced techniques. If you want to call the shots, you certainly can. And some of those techniques include things like promotional modeling, manipulating a product hierarchy, going top-down or middle-out if you want, new product forecasting methods, and dynamic regression. So again, we offer sort of different modes. One way you can do it completely automatically. Another way of doing it would be for you to call the shots if you so desire. So Forecast Pro XE, I like to think of it kind of as a desktop analysis tool. It's a very useful piece of software that I can just pull down and generate forecasts when I need to. It's designed primarily for taking a close look at items. And so sometimes when you're generating forecasts, there's a difference between forecasting, say, 5,000 items in support of demand planning or inventory versus really taking a careful look at, a handful of items that I want to forecast really well. And so it's designed to work with modest amounts of data. You can work with up to 100 items at a time. And again, it offers, in addition to automatic modeling, you can really go quite in depth, a lot of different forecasting methods, a lot of diagnostic displays to help you through the forecasting process. So whether you're a beginner and want to rely primarily on automatic approaches, or whether you're a seasoned forecaster and want to really get your hands dirty and get into the details, Forecast Pro XE can be used for either audiences. It is the only version of Forecast Pro which offers dynamic regression. So if regression modeling is part of what you want to accomplish, it is the version of Forecast Pro which supports that. Okay, here is a roadmap of how we're going to spend our time today. We're going to start off with looking at the product and running through, let's call it a sample forecasting session. So we'll show you the basics. How do I read in the data? How do I generate a forecast? How do I look at the results? We'll then take a look at custom modeling. If I don't want to use expert selection, how do I go about dictating the models I wish to use? We'll look at a couple of specific forecasting approaches, such as manipulating a product hierarchy, going top-down, for instance, as well as take a look at dynamic regression. As I mentioned before, this is the only version of Forecast Pro that does regression, and therefore we want to make sure we'll show you how it operates. The last bullet there says questions and answers. If you are attending this as a live event, then you, as Ken mentioned earlier, you can use your chat facility to ask a question at any time. If you do not receive a response, we'll take a certain number of questions live as part of the webinar. But if you don't get a live response to your question, we will answer your response by email after the conclusion of the webinar. So, and actually, we'll stop periodically through the webinar and take some questions as we go. Okay, but without further ado, let's actually jump into the product and show you how Forecast Pro XE works. Okay, so this is Forecast Pro XE, and it's a fairly standard Windows-style interface. You've got an icon bar across the top here, where most of the most commonly used tasks can be executed. There's also drop-down menus to access all of the functionality. And basically, the first step here in using Forecast Pro XE is to read in some data. Okay, so I'm going to call up what we call the options dialog box, but what I want to illustrate here is that the data can come from different sources. It could come from Excel, either the XLS or the XLSX. It could come from text files, such as CSV files or MLT files. It can also come via what's called ODBC, stands for Open Database Connectivity, and it's a way of reading tables or queries from relational databases. So if your data is in Access or SQL Server and you want to read it into Forecast Pro, you can read it in directly, or alternatively, if you want to put it into a spreadsheet or a text file, we can read it from there. For this demonstration, I'm going to use Excel as a way of bringing in data, and let's bring in some data. So I'm going to read in a data sheet. I'm going to start with this data set called cameras, so I'll double-click on it. And the program puts me in what we call the script. And in the spreadsheet called cameras, we have two different data sets. One is sales of a instant developing camera. So it's one of these cameras where you take a picture and it actually spits out and develops the film, and in 30 seconds you've got the picture you just took. And the company also has a variable format camera that they sell. And in this very simple example, we're going to work with these two items. So I'm going to double-click on the first one and the second one, and that puts it on our script here. And I'm going to click the OK button, and when I do, several things are going to happen. So let's watch what happens when I click the OK button. Okay, so what's happened? Well, one thing is Forecast Pro XE has gone ahead and generated a forecast. So we have the first item selected. It's our instant developing cameras. The green line is the historic demand. So we appear to have about 4 years worth of monthly data, and you can see our sales. To the right, we have a red line, that's the forecast, and we have these blue lines, which are the confidence limits, or the spread around the forecast. So when we clicked OK, it just automatically generated a forecast for everything on the script. In this case, the two items, the I camera, and if I click on the V camera, you can see that the graph just changed, and the report underneath changed as well. And now we're looking at the forecast for the variable format camera. So on the left-hand side here, we call this the navigator, but I can click on an item and it will display all the relevant information for that item. So now, how did it generate the forecast? Well, we can discover that by looking through our forecast report, which appears here along the bottom. So you'll notice the report is broken into different sections, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit and look at the section that's called Expert Analysis. Expert Analysis, this section, describes the procedure that the expert selection went through in selecting the methodology to use to generate this particular forecast. So the procedure has kind of two pieces to it. It's a two-prong approach, if you will. The first piece is Forecast Pro has a series of rules, logical rules, built into the software. There's about 200, actually a few more than 200 rules in the software. And so it runs through it tests the data in various ways and runs it through a series of rules. Sometimes these rules will lead us directly to a forecasting method. Other times they may narrow the field. So they may eliminate certain methods from contention. So I'll give you an example of a rule. Let's say that we have less than 24 data points. So one of the things the program is going to do is to look at the number of data points you have, and one of our rules is that if you have less than 24 data points, we will not be able to build seasonal Box-Jenkins models. So this is an example of a rule which would eliminate a method, in this case seasonal Box-Jenkins models, from contention. So it's a rule that would narrow the field. So let's read what our analysis section says. It says, using rule-based logic, I have narrowed down the choice to exponential smoothing or Box-Jenkins. I will perform an out-of-sample test to select between these two approaches. So it narrowed down the choice to exponential smoothing or Box-Jenkins. What it's saying is either of these methods could be used effectively to forecast this particular item. So the real question is, okay, if I could use either of them, which one should I use? And it's telling us it's going to do an out-of-sample test to decide. Now, our purpose here is to show you how the product works, so I'm not going to describe this in too great a detail, but an automatic test says, or an out-of-sample test, says don't use all the data. So let's say that we've got these 4 years worth of data, and we decide to chop off, if you will, the last 6 months. So we'll use the data starting here and ending here and forecast the remaining 6 months that we did not use to generate the model. That's called an out-of-sample test because I'm testing the forecasts on a part of the data that I did not use. It wasn't part of the sample. I could do this for different methods, and based on that out-of-sample test, determine which one performed better. It's kind of like saying, if we had forecasted this item 6 months ago, using hindsight, we could compare different methods and determine which one would have been better to use. So that's the concept of an out-of-sample test. And here's the results from that test. The cumulative MAD stands for mean absolute deviation, but it's really just the unit error. How many units were we off by? The cumulative MAD for exponential smoothing was 1,378. So on average, we were off by 1,378 units. And for Box-Jenkins was 2,450. That's bigger, okay? So we had a smaller error, only 1,378 versus Box-Jenkins, 2,450. The rolling out-of-sample test used a maximum horizon of 6 and generated 21 forecasts for each item. We actually used something called a rolling-based forecast. It's a variation on the straight out-of-sample test. It's a stronger way of doing it. But the bottom line is we tried it both ways. Exponential smoothing did a better job. And based on that, we're now going to use exponential smoothing to generate our forecast. So at this point, the expert analysis is over. It has selected exponential smoothing. The program then goes back and uses all the data. So starting here and going all the way to the end of the green line, and it uses exponential smoothing in this particular instance to generate a forecast. Okay, if we scroll down in the display, we come to the model details. Forecast Pro is not a black box. If you want to know the details behind how a forecast was generated, it will always tell you. So in this particular example, we used exponential smoothing, and we used a form of exponential smoothing that is not trended but is seasonal. And I think if you look at that green line, that makes some sense. You can see there's really not much of a trend, but there definitely is a seasonal pattern from year to year. So in addition to which model was used, what about all the details? What about the numbers that go into the equations? If we want to view them, they're shown here, and I'll show you in a minute. Everything can be customized. So if I'm not interested in this level of detail, I can change it. But again, Forecast Pro will show you all the details if you want them. If I continue down, we come to what's called within sample statistics. So for those of you who are well versed in forecasting, this will be familiar territory. But if I want to look at statistics like the R-squared or the mean, the MAPE, the MAD, the Durbin-Watson, they're all listed here, and I can do so. If I'm using expert selection, then we don't usually dwell on within sample statistics. On the other hand, if I were doing custom modeling, then indeed I might be more interested. But again, the main point is that if you want a lot of information about how the forecast is generated, you can certainly get it. Probably the most interesting section is the one I'm on the display now. What are the forecasts? So here they are. Here's some quarterly and annual totals. Here's the confidence limits. If I scroll down a bit further, we've got a few summary statistics about the forecast, the total, the average, the min, and the max. So again, this is currently we're on what we call the report tab, so we can look at a graph of the forecast and a forecast report to find out exactly how the forecasts were generated and to view them graphically. Now, both the graph and the report can be highly customized. And almost all displays in Forecast Pro, if not all displays, I believe it's all displays, can be customized. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to click up here on what we call a curtain menu, and this allows me to customize the displays. So currently we're viewing what we call the standard report, but let's say the only thing, maybe I'm presenting a presentation for management, and I know they don't want to look at the statistical details, so I want a report that just shows the forecast. Okay, so I'm going to say forecast only, and notice that at this point, if I scroll down, the only thing in the report is the forecast. There's other options. I could get a basic report. This has a little more detail than just the forecast, but it's not as full as the standard report. I could do a complete report. This has all of the gory details. So in addition to what we looked at before, you'll find things like the within sample statistics include additional statistics, things like the MAD mean ratio or the SMAPE. These are less commonly used statistics, but if individuals want to see them, we can make them available. We have a section on the historic data, so if I want to look at the fit, I can do that. If I scroll down further, we'll find at the very bottom here, after the forecasts are displayed, we have a section on the safety stock. So if I want to know the safety stock calculations, the demand during lead times, the reorder points, all of that is available on this report. So again, our reports can be standardized. Another option is a custom report. And this literally allows you to generate any report you want. So you can pick and choose all of the items to display and things like how precisely to display them. So let me click on one of these tabs. Here's the Within Sample Statistic tab, and I can pick and choose any of the statistics I want to see, and I can control their precision and build myself a customized report. All the other sections of the report, the historic data, the forecast data, they can all, in a similar fashion, be customized to my needs. So a great deal of customization can be done to the forecast report. I'm going to put ours back to the standard. And let's consider the graph. We can customize that as well. So one thing we can do is choose what the graph should display. So maybe in addition to the forecast and confidence limits, I'll turn on the fitted values. So you can see this red line is how we track the data. And again, I can turn on and off different components of the graph. I can also change the layout. So we've got a fairly simple line graph. Maybe I want to jazz it up. Let's make it a 3D line graph, or maybe a column. Okay, but again, I can control this. I can do things like maybe put a title on the graph. So this data, it comes from a company. We'll call it the ABC Camera Company. Okay, and you can see that now I've got a label on the top, and if I wanted to put labels on the X and Y axis, I could. If I want to change the scaling, I could. You have a great deal of control over what the graph display should look like. You can also do year-over-year graphs. Okay, so if rather than looking at a longitudinal view of the data, I want to look at a year-over-year, I could do that. Again, maybe I want to see that as a column graph. But you know, the main point here is both the graph and the report are very, very flexible. With just a few clicks of the mouse, we can choose whatever components we want to display or not display, and it really makes it easy to get the information that you want in a format that you want it displayed in. I'm going to turn off those fitted values here. Okay, so thus far we've really seen that we could read in data rather easily. In our example, it came in from Excel. We can generate an automatic forecast. Just use Forecast Pro's expert selection to generate a forecast. And we can view the results. We can view it graphically. We can also view the details in the forecast report. I'm going to click on this other tab at the bottom here. It says Override. And I want to point out that in addition to viewing the forecast graphically, we can also display them in this grid. And I think I'll add the history. Okay. So now I've got the history and the forecast. And if I want to make a change, so you can think of maybe the statistical forecast as the baseline forecast, but I want to make a change to it. Let's say I know in March and April I'm going to run a promotion on my instant cameras, and I've never run that promotion before. And I think it's going to increase the forecast by, let's say, 15%. So I'll use the spinner to push this up to 15% and click the button. And it's showing me a suggested change, increasing the forecast by 15%. I can see that graphically as well. And if I want to commit to it, I'll hit the button. And now I have a statistical forecast. That's the forecast generated by Forecast Pro, along with some overrides and a final forecast or an adjusted forecast. So Forecast Pro allows you to not only view the forecast, but also in cases where you may want to change a number or two, it's very easy to do so. Okay, so again, now let's say we're done and it's time to save our work, and Forecast Pro allows us to save our work in several different ways. But let's say we want to save it out to Excel. Then it's going to output a number of different things. One is, for every item we generated a forecast, it'll put a tab on our worksheet which shows the graph and shows the report. And it will show a version of the graph and a version of the report that matches the one you created. So if you had a 3D line graph and it was a management report, so you had forecasts only, then that's what will be saved out on each tab for each item. In addition, very often you want access to just the forecasted numbers. Okay, so maybe I'm going to generate some forecasts, I'm going to bring them into another application. I am less concerned about a graphical report that's more geared towards human beings, and what I really want is an output spreadsheet or text file or ODBC table that I can read into another application. So we refer to that kind of output as numeric output. Okay, so this is the numeric output preview, and basically what it does is to show you a picture of the information that will be saved out when we save to Excel. Right now we've got it set to some very basics, so for each item, again, we just have the forecasts as numeric values. I mentioned earlier, every display in Forecast Pro can be customized to your needs. So if I pull down the curtain menu here, you can see that there's a variety of things I could include in the numeric output. So the basic is just the forecast, but maybe I also want that upper confidence limit. So I'll turn that on, and notice that I now have a couple of rows for each item because I'm showing both the forecast and the upper confidence limits. There are a lot of other things I could add if I wanted to. On the Layout tab, I can control things like the precision, how much, how precise do I want those values to be. I could choose other formatting options. So for instance, I have it in rows, but maybe I prefer it in columns, or maybe even in transaction style to put into another database. But let's leave it at horizontal for our example here. And we'll put it out. This is a better format for spreadsheets. I could also include things like any of the statistics or a indication of the model that I used. So I can include any information I want and control the format. Safety stock, if that's important, I can include that as well. So, but for this example, we're just going to show a real basic one. And I'll go ahead and save this. So I'll click on this icon here. It looks like a diskette. And we'll go ahead and we'll save that out to Excel. And then why don't we actually, let's open it up in Excel and see what it looks like. So I'm going to open Excel here. You can see we're on a blank worksheet. I'll go under File, Open. Here's that output sheet that we created. Let me help to format it a little bit. And what you can see is here's the numeric output. So, and it looks just like it did in that preview window. Each item, I've got 2 rows, I've got a header, I've got the forecast that I specified at the precision that I asked for. The other 2 tabs on the worksheet are for the forecast report. So we only forecasted 2 items, so here's iCamera. Notice that the graph is here, and underneath is the report. And if I go to our last tab, here's our other item, the variable format camera. It has a graph, it has a report. And again, these reports are going to be formatted the same as they were in the program. So if we had a 3D line graph in Forecast Pro and we save out the report, it'll be a 3D line graph here. If we had a very detailed information in the forecast report, we'd have that as well. If we had the forecast only option on, we just have the forecast. So you use Forecast Pro to design the output, and it's really very easy to do. So let's go back to Forecast Pro and just sort of summarize again. I've shown you the basic operations. We read in some data. We used the expert selection to automatically build a forecast. And all we really had to do there was click OK. The expert selection is the default, and it did it all automatically. We entered some overrides. So we went through and decided to make a change or two. And then when we were happy with everything, we saved the results. So these are, again, very basic operations. And we took our time going through them. But I hope I've conveyed to you really how easy this is. It really is the kind of package that you can just pick up and use. So it may use some fairly involved methodology, but applying it, it's very much designed for business people, and applying it is very straightforward. So we finished the first section of our tour, which is the basic operations, and we're going to proceed on to custom modeling. But before we do, let's see if there are any questions. And Ken?
Yes, Eric, we do have a couple of questions so far. First, when you use the expert selection to pick the best model, why do you use the mean absolute deviation for the out-of-sample test as opposed to the mean absolute % error?
Okay, well that's a good question, and let's just jump back to the program for a second and explain that question. The person is pointing out that we used a statistic in this out-of-sample test called the mean absolute deviation, but really it's just the unit error, okay? So it's how many units were we off by. And we looked at this before, and we said that for exponential smoothing we were off by 1,378. Excuse me. And for Box-Jenkins, we were off by more than that, 2,450. So the MAD is a measure of the unit error. A more popular statistic that's commonly reported is something called the MAPE. It stands for the mean absolute % error. And we could have used it here, but it's not as well suited for the job. The MAPE, or the percentage error, is very scale sensitive. So it'd actually be fine for our example here because we have high volume data, but if you had low volume data, then the MAPE can take on extreme values and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So when we're looking at individual items and comparing performance, one at a time, the MAD is a good choice. It's kind of outside the scope of today's presentation, but there are times where you want to look at errors across items, and then the MAD's probably not such a good choice, and depending on the scale of your data, the MAPE may be better. But again, the answer to the question is, if we're looking at performance for an individual item, the MAD is better suited because it doesn't have the same kind of scaling issues that the MAPE has. You said there was another question?
Yes. Can you add comments to forecast overrides?
Okay. So again, we showed an override facility where we put in some some overrides, and the question is, can we add comments? The quick answer here is no. The real focus of Forecast Pro XE is in generating a forecast and really establishing the best numbers possible. I called it a desktop analysis tool before, and that's really what it is. There are other versions of Forecast Pro, specifically Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track, where they're really designed as more of an ongoing system where every week or every month I'm going to forecast a lot of items, and I want to have a permanent record of things like the changes that I've made. So those products are different. They allow actually up to 10 override rows. You can also have calculated rows. You can bring in other information like open orders and stuff like that. And you can put in comments, and there's a log and all that good stuff. But again, the packages are different. Here in Forecast Pro XE, we don't allow you to do comments. We do allow you to do overrides. And what we're trying to do is to establish a statistical forecast, that's the top row, and a final forecast. And you can output both of them. I didn't actually do it in our example, but you can. And you can save the overrides and you can load them into another session. But again, it's not really designed for collaborative forecasting, and therefore the functionality is a little more basic than some of the other versions of Forecast Pro. Okay. Okay, why don't we continue on actually. So we'll go into our next section, which is custom modeling. And what we want to do here, let's go back to the product, is we have been using expert selection. We've been letting Forecast Pro decide how to go about generating the forecast. And I'm going to open up another tab along the bottom here, and it's called Model Settings. And this is how we specify alternative methods to use. So I'm going to drop down the box here, and notice that expert selection is the first option, okay, and it's the default. So if you don't give instructions to the contrary, Forecast Pro will use expert selection and automatically generate a forecast. And expert selection really works pretty well, or even very well, when you're generating a forecast off the past history. But let's say I wanted to use a specific method. I could choose any of the ones listed here. So if I wanted to use exponential smoothing, I could. We support 12 different exponential smoothing models. Box Jenkins, we implement a full multivariate implementation of Box Jenkins. We have very simple models like moving averages. We have some low volume models. So the discrete data models are, if you have low integer data, that's appropriate. We have an intermittent data model. If you have lots of zero demand periods, then we have what's called the Croston's model to help you forecast that. There are some curve fitting routines. If we just want to put a straight line through the data or some other curve, we can do it. Again, simple models here. In addition to moving average, if we want to do things like same as last year or plus a percentage, you could do that. There's a couple of new product models here, forecasting by analogy. This allows you to base the forecast on the profile of another product. So I've got a new product and I want it to have a certain shape. I can use the by analogy approach. And the Bass diffusion model is another new product forecasting method for when we're launching a new technology and we want to know how it's adopted out in the real world. It can help us model that. There are also some methods that aren't listed on this list here. There are event models for promotional models or business interruptions. There's regression, which we'll talk about later in the demonstration. But let's take a look at one of these. Let's look at Box-Jenkins. And here what I'm doing is I'm saying I don't want to use expert selection. I want to specifically use Box-Jenkins. And you can see there's a little thumbnail here, and it's actually showing the Box-Jenkins forecast. And for those of you familiar with Box-Jenkins, there's a couple of different ways you can build a Box-Jenkins model. One option in Forecast Pro is to do it completely automatically. So we're not using expert selection. We're not going to use exponential smoothing. We're not going to use the Croston's model. We're limiting ourselves. We specifically said Box-Jenkins, but we can still do the Box-Jenkins part automatically, or alternatively, we can do it on a custom basis. So in a custom Box-Jenkins model, you define what's called the model orders, and maybe I come in here and put in one of these MA terms, so I'll change that to 1, and maybe I want a seasonal autoregressive term, so I'll change that to 1. I know that's not going to make a lot of sense if you don't know about ARIMA modeling, but if you do, the gist of this is I can specify the exact details of the model. If I want to use transformations, I can do it. For somebody who's well-versed in ARIMA, you have access to everything. If you're going to use this package for teaching, it's an excellent teaching tool. The students can come in and really learn the differences between the models. Everything's in real time. When I made those changes, it automatically changed the model and changed the thumbnail. If I go to the Report tab, the model is no longer expert selection. It's a user-defined ARIMA. ARIMA is just another word for Box-Jenkins, and it's the one we specified. And all of the details, in this case the coefficients for the different model orders, are shown along with t-stats, etc. But the main idea is I can specify any model I want, and in some cases, if I want support in helping me decide what to do, I could go under what's called Advanced Diagnostics. So I'm going to open yet another tab, the Advanced Diagnostics tab, and for instance, when doing Box-Jenkins modeling, some people like to look at things like the error autocorrelation function, which is shown here. So this is looking for patterns in the errors, and actually it looks like there are some here. And I'm going to open up the Display tab and just point out, for those who are well-versed in modeling, who really want to get into the details, there's a lot of power here. There's a lot of things we can do. If I want to look at a display of the errors, so this is just month by month. What's the actual? What's the error? Here's a histogram of the errors or the residuals. As we've seen, the error autocorrelation function. There's also the autocorrelation function and the partial autocorrelation function, which can be useful if I'm deciding, say, orders of differencing. I understand that a lot of this is not going to make sense to some of the people who are listening today out there, but for those who want to get very detailed, we can show a lot of information. I just turned on the correlation matrix, and we also have the covariance matrix. But again, the main idea is we've got some very advanced diagnostics. We hide them away on a tab, which can be turned on and off. So if we don't want to look at them, you certainly don't have to. But if you want them, they're all there. And when doing custom modeling, and I would say a minority of Forecast Pro users, a strong minority, but a minority, use custom modeling. So back to our Model Settings tab. This was an example for Box-Jenkins. All the other ones work in a somewhat similar fashion. Again, if I go into, say, curve fitting, here's the curve fitting routine. This did an automatic one, but let's say I want to I'll fit a straight line through the data. It would have been a straight line. I'm actually on the item where we put in some adjustments, and that's why you've got a little bump there. If I wanted to, I could also put in, something. Let's do a quadratic curve. This will look a little better if I put the fitted values on. Again, there's the quadratic. There's the straight line with our adjustments. But the main thing I'm trying to convey is if we want to do custom modeling, it's very, very simple. I come to the Modeling tab and I select the model I want. Alternatively, the default is expert selection, and to generate expert selection forecasts, there's really nothing I need to do. I just click the button and it's done for me. Okay, so let's go back to our slide for a second. And we've come to the end of our second module. So we did our basic operations, and we saw we could build things using expert selection. We saw we could customize reports and graphs. We could make changes very easily. We looked at some custom modeling. We gave you a flavor for it. In a 45-minute demonstration, my goal is not to make you experts in custom modeling. It's to give you a flavor for how things work. So we took a look at some custom modeling. Our next section has to do with working with a hierarchy. So we're about to get started on that. But before we do, Ken, are there any additional questions?
Yes, we have a couple more questions. First, can you see the details at the product family level?
Okay. That's actually a pretty good segue into our next topic because we are going to be looking at a hierarchy, and that involves different levels of aggregation for the data. So the idea here is you might have total sales. We're going to see an example where that breaks down to product categories, which break down to customers, which break down to SKUs, stock keeping units. And yes, you can view the data at any level you want. You can apply the models at any level you want. You can make adjustments at any level you want. So Forecast Pro is actually a very good implementation in terms of working with data at different levels. And again, we'll be coming back to this because our next section deals with exactly that. You said there's another question?
Yes, one more question. How would you compare the results from one model you build with the results from expert selection?
Okay, good question. So the idea here is I run expert selection, and I have an alternative, which is maybe a customized model, and how do I know which one is better? There are ways of doing this. What I would say is the following. If you're going to base the forecast completely off the past history, it's probably going to be very difficult to outperform the expert selection, because that is actually what it's designed to do, is to generate a forecast based on the past history. The exception to that rule might be short data sets. If you have a short, say you have less than a year's worth of data, it's very hard to generate an automatic forecast because you don't have a lot of data, and statistical forecasts are based on data. So that's an area where you might definitely want to call the shots yourself. But the question is, how do I compare and contrast, let's say, an expert selection forecast with a different one? And what I would say is probably the best way to do it is using an out-of-sample test. It requires you have enough data to do so. But we do have this holdout. You can see up here, we don't have actually the time for me to demonstrate this. It's not part of our agenda. But you can try different approaches, say custom models versus expert selection, and define a holdout. And it's just like in the expert selection. We can say, how well did one method perform versus the other? And it's a pretty straightforward operation to do. So that's probably the best way to do it. Sometimes people will look at the within sample statistics, and they'll do things like, what model has the biggest R-squared? That's not a great way of doing a model comparison. I've seen it done. What it really tells you is which model fits the data better, which is different than forecasting the data. So in terms of best practices, I would say an out-of-sample test is probably the best way to proceed. And again, in Forecast Pro XE, that's a pretty straightforward kind of experiment to run. Okay, let's pop back to our agenda here. Again, our next section is going to be working with a product hierarchy. So for this example, I'm actually going to start up a fresh version of Forecast Pro XE. This is going to use a different data set, and I'll go ahead and open it up. And this data set comes from a commercial bakery, and we've got it in the spreadsheet. It's called Bakery. I'll double click on that. And Forecast Pro will read it in, and it will actually generate the whole hierarchy based on the way the spreadsheet was formatted. And let me actually close this up a little bit and explain what we're looking at. So here's total sales for the bakery. If we drill down a little bit, we'll see that this is the product category level. So total sales consists of sales of muffins and sales of cakes. If I drill into muffins, we get to the customer level. So here's Stuff Mart, Sid's Club, Groceryland. All the data I'm showing you today is real data from Forecast Pro clients. Okay, so in this particular one, again, they have total sales, breaking down to product category, breaking down to customer, and under that they break down, actually this breaks down to grain and fruits, so there's a subcategory, and then at the bottom is the SKU. If I fully open this, there we go, what you can see is I've got probably 60 or 70 different items that we've just forecasted. And notice that when I hit OK, just like we did in our first example, it's forecasted everything. So I've got a forecast at every single level of this hierarchy, including the total and the categories and the customer level and the subcategories and the SKU. So this is an example of a multiple level approach. It can be done completely automatically. I can specify models at any level, just as we did before. So I have full access to all of the modeling, and I can go to the modeling tab. I can go up to a group and do it there. I could go into the override tabs. In fact, let me just put in a number here. So we've got Stuff Mart's sales here in August was 734,000 cases. I'm going to change that to 1 million. Okay, so I'm just typed in 1 million and I'll commit to it. And what I want to point out is we changed at this customer level for muffins. That's why this icon is red. And if I do that, the forecast for August for total muffins is also changed. So you can see they're different here. And so the changes I make at any level will propagate upwards just through aggregation. And they'll also go downwards. So changing the Stuff Mart level will change the subcategory and will change the SKU. And that's all done by proportional allocation. But the main point here is that I can work at any level of the hierarchy. This particular hierarchy has 5 levels to it, but you can have as many levels as you want. I can specify different models. I can make adjustments to the forecast, and it basically operates the same way it did when we weren't working with multiple levels. So it's very, 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 very flexible. The other thing I can do is, let's say I want to go top-down. So some of you have probably heard of top-down forecasting or bottom-up forecasting or middle-out forecasting, and it has to do with where the forecasts are generated and how they propagate up and down a hierarchy. Let's say I wanted to forecast at the muffins level and go top-down. I'd right mouse click, and you can see this top-down option here, and I'll just select it. And the forecast will change because now I'm using a top-down approach to this hierarchy based at the muffins level. So again, this is not a webinar on multiple level forecasting. My job here is not to, for those of you who aren't familiar with top-down and bottom-up approaches, I'm not going to really explain them in any depth here. What I want to show, though, is using them is very, very simple. It's a very easy implementation. I probably should mention, if you do want to learn more about multiple level forecasting or any of the other topics that we've looked at, like box Jenkins or smoothing or regression, which is coming up next, we do have webinars that are on these topics. You can access them through forecastpro.com. They're pre-recorded, so you can watch them on demand, and they're free. There's also a YouTube channel, Forecast Pro, which has a whole lot of educational webinars and things like that on it. So if you are interested in learning more on the methodology side, by all means, take advantage of some of those resources. But again, our task today is to show you a demonstration of XC, and what I hope I've conveyed here is that working with the multiple level hierarchy is very straightforward. All the things that we've shown you apply to multiple level as well as single level, and again, like most things in Forecast Pro, it's designed to be very simple, very easy to use. Okay, so we're getting there. We're on to our last topic, which is going to be dynamic regression. Before we launch into that, let's pause and see if there are questions.
Yeah, just one quick question, and not necessarily specific to forecasting a product hierarchy. That is, can Forecast Pro Unlimited forecast more than 100 items, and what is the upper limits of their capabilities?
Okay. Again, our tour today is on Forecast Pro XE. There are two other versions of Forecast Pro. There's Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track. Both of them are not limited in terms of the number of items, but they're also very different products. So they're really kind of designed for different purposes. If you are interested in them, I'd encourage you to let us know, and we can give you a tour of it. And there's also, as I mentioned earlier, on the website you can look at some tours on the Forecast Pro channel on YouTube. You can run some demos on that as well. But back to the question, are they limited? No, they're not in terms of a hard and fast limitation. We've done some surveys. Users of Forecast Pro Unlimited and Forecast Pro Track are often forecasting somewhere between, say, 300, 400 items up to hundreds of thousands of items. Most of our users are in kind of the 3,000 item range in terms of end items. And what I would say is, although there's no hard and fast limitations, if you're working with 100,000 items or more, then you may start running into performance issues. So less than that, you're going to be in good shape. More than that, you want to make sure you have a fast machine with lots of memory. There's other factors involved, like data length and stuff like that. So I think what I would say is, if you're curious about those types of limitations, give us a quick call, describe your data, and we will tell you what you can expect. But again, if you're forecasting less than 100,000 items, you'd be all set. And if you're more than that, probably you want to touch base with us because performance may be an issue. But today we're talking about Forecast Pro XE, so let's get back on topic. And our last section here is dynamic regression. And it's really very different than the other methodologies we've looked at. I'm going to start up another session here for Forecast Pro. And Forecast Pro really has kind of two basic modes. You notice this drop-down box here. It says expert selection. And the other option here is dynamic regression. And so it kind of has, again, Forecast Pro XE has two modes, expert selection mode and regression mode. And, oddly enough, if you look at our users, and I mentioned we do surveys from time to time, what we find is that we have lots of Forecast Pro users who never use dynamic regression and always use either expert selection or other time series methods. We have other users who only use regression. There are some users who use both, but there's not a whole lot of them. And I think it stems mostly from the type of data they're forecasting. So there are certain industries where the data lends itself to regression. There's lots of explanatory variables and leading indicators. And there are other industries where there's not, where almost all the forecasts are forms of extrapolation or maybe extrapolation with events, for promotions or business interruptions and things like that. So regression is important and very useful if you have the data for it, and not everybody does. But again, as I mentioned before, Forecast Pro XE is the only version of Forecast Pro that does regression, and therefore I wanted to make sure we touch upon it in this demonstration. And so let's read in some data. And for this example, we're going to forecast sales of electricity. And I'm going to give you a flavor for how this works. On the other hand, I know that not all of us are familiar with regression, so some of this terminology, may be new to some. But I'm going to list sales on the first line of the script. Sales is going to be our dependent variable. That's the variable we want to forecast. And then underneath it, you would list any explanatory variables you want to use. So I'm just double-clicking on some of these items. And this sets up the variables for the regression. So in this example, I'm going to forecast sales of electricity, And basically I've got some temperature related variables, things like what's called heating and cooling degree days, but they're constructed to show hot temperatures where people might be running their air conditioning, or cold temperatures where they might be running, say, electric space heating. We have disposable income for the service territory. We have air conditioning saturation rates for the service territory. I'll put in a constant term as well, and these are the variables we're going to use. I'm actually going to turn off disposable income and AC, or air conditioning saturation rates, and so the model initially is only going to use our temperature variables in the constant term, and by turning off these variables, it allows Forecast Pro to test as to whether they should be included. So I'll show you how this works. I'm going to click the OK button, and when I do, it builds a forecast. Okay, so here is the forecast. I'm going to put the fitted values on, and you can see it's already pretty good. We're really capturing a lot of the change in the data. Electric power is something you can forecast highly accurately, and it almost always uses regression, and for residential sales it almost always uses temperature variables. On the navigator here, we can look at the explanatory variables. So these are them there. And regression is really built in a series of steps. So we have an initial model, and we have the details on it. So again, for those who are familiar with regression, we're outputting the coefficients, the standard errors, and the t-statistics. If we go under our Advanced Diagnostics tab, we can look at things like the error autocorrelation function. You can see there's a whole lot of correlation left in the data, so we've got a lot of work to do. We can view the correlation matrix, or the covariance matrix. Okay, so the diagnostics and regression become a little more important. The other thing Forecast Pro has, which is really pretty neat and pretty unique to Forecast Pro, is in addition to sort of the standard diagnostics and the within sample statistics, we have specialized test batteries that tell you how to change the model and how to improve it. So here's the first one. This is what we call the variable specification tests. We've done excluded variable tests for the disposable income and the air conditioning saturation rates and some lag variables and a trend term. But the bottom line is we run a batch of tests, and we try to point you in the right direction. So here it says try adding a trend to the model. So that's one option. There's another test battery immediately below it. It's called the dynamics tests. There's a lot more tests in this one. It's looking for time series components. It's testing lags of the dependent variable as well as Cochrane-Orcutt terms. That's what these auto terms are. So again, I know not all of us will know what these terms mean, but a dynamic regression approach blends explanatory variables with dynamics, or time series elements, and that's what we're testing for here. It says try adding auto -1 to the model, and we saw there's a lot of correlations here. That probably makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And to do it, I just right mouse click and choose Add, and the two recommendations are up here at the top, and underneath there are other options I could add, different Cochrane-Orcutt terms, different lags. I can always go back to the script and add anything I wish, but I'll go ahead and add that auto -1. And notice that that automatically updated the model and improved the model. We're fitting a little better. If we look at our terms, we now include a Cochrane-Orcutt term, and we could go through the process again. We can, excuse me, we can look at our diagnostics. We could look at the advanced diagnostics. Notice that this is very much cleaned up. Still have a little seasonal correlation here, but this is much better. And we could go through those test batteries again. Okay. And in fact, our recommendation, try adding auto -12, that would help with the seasonal pattern. So again, I'm not trying to do the best job I can to forecast this particular data set. I'm trying to give you a flavor of how the regression modeling works. And what I would say is it's an iterative approach. I try a model, I look at the diagnostics, and then I add or remove something. I'll go ahead and add our latest recommendation. And you can see, we're just fitting the data like a glove here. And again, residential power consumption is something that you can forecast highly accurately. But again, what I'm trying to convey is that the Forecast Pro implementation of dynamic regression is very good. It's very immediate. You build models and modify them with just a click, click, click kind of approach. For those of you who've built regressions in Excel or SAS or SPSS or other applications, then this is not the case. You're writing procedures, you're highlighting ranges, you're doing lots of stuff, and experimenting and building a lot of different models is time consuming. In Forecast Pro, it's very, very immediate, and again, it's really an excellent implementation of regression. So at this point, we've really run through our agenda. I hope that I've conveyed what I've set out to do, which is Forecast Pro XC is a very comprehensive product. It has a lot of different forecasting methods and a lot of power, a lot of really kind of advanced modeling capabilities. On the other hand, it also has a lot of automatic approaches. So if you're new to forecasting, if you want a lot of guidance, if you want the program to make decisions automatically, it can do that, and it does it really well. It's also very easy to use and very easy to customize. If I want customized graphs and reports, you just pull down a menu, click on what you want, and you got them. If I want to output data to Excel, again, click an icon, save the file, and you're done. So it's very easy to use, very powerful. Hopefully I've gotten some of that stuff across. So let's just pause. We did just run through regression. Do we have any regression questions?
We just have one last question, Eric. How does one know if regression is applicable to one's industry?
Okay. Let's see. I guess I would say the following, which is there are certain industries where you will absolutely know, such as electric power, because everyone does it that way. Okay, and because the explanatory variables are so important that you could not really consider modeling without them. So there are certain industries where we know regression is important. We know that the company has always forecasted it that way, and there's really just not a mystery about it. But I think the question is more, what about the cases where we're not sure, where we think it might add value but we're not sure? And I guess what I would say there is that the success of using regression hinges upon the availability of important explanatory variables, and ideally the availability of what's called leading indicators, variables that run ahead of what you want to try to forecast. So if you're in an industry that has leading indicators, then you're in an industry where regression may add value and you probably want to experiment with it. If you can get information about other companies in your industry, say you're at a trade show or a conference where there's others from your industry, ask around. What are people's experiences using different models? So that's always a good exercise. If that kind of information is not available, I would say experiment. It doesn't take long, particularly in Forecast Pro, to try some of these models and see what kind of results you get. Compare them to, say, time series approaches. And, we had a question earlier about how do we compare two different models. You could run an out-of-sample test and say, gee, did the regression add value? So there are definitely approaches to doing this. And again, what I would say, I mentioned before, we have a lot of people who only use regression and a lot of people who only use time series. And that's really a reflection of the data. But if you're in doubt, then do a test and see if it adds value. Okay, well that actually wraps up the demonstration portion of this. Before we sign off, I do want to mention a few more things. One is that there was a lot of functionality in Forecast Pro XC, or there is a lot of functionality in Forecast Pro XC that we did not demonstrate today. And the slide tells us a few of these things. Event modeling. Our ability to bring in promotional schedules, to bring in schedules of when various things have happened, business interruptions, holidays that move around the calendar. Event modeling is very powerful. It is easy to implement. The data requirements are much less than with regression, and it's just in 45-minute demonstration. We didn't have time to go into it. New product forecasting models. If you have new products, whether they're new to the company or new to the world or product line extensions or replacement products, we've got approaches for that, including things like forecasting by analogy, where you can model the sales of a new product upon the sales of, say, a different product launch, or the BAS diffusion model, where we can model, new to world kind of products. There's outlier detection and correction. Forecast Pro can automatically go through the data and detect unusual data points, and if you want, it can automatically correct them prior to generating the forecast. So, and there's out-of-sample testing. We mentioned that actually a couple of times during the demonstration. So there's a lot of functionality that we didn't go through today, but I want you to have an awareness that it is there. And in fact, again, this list is not exhaustive. There's other things in here as well, which brings me, I guess, to our last slide here, which is, how do I learn more, and how do I get Forecast Pro? And as always, what does it cost? The Forecast Pro, a single license, costs $1,295. It is a perpetual license, so it's not an annual fee. We do offer discounts depending on the situation. There are quantity discounts, so if you want to buy multiple licenses, we can quote that. If you're going to use it for academic research, if you're going to use it for teaching, then there are academic discounts available. And as always, if you have any questions whatsoever, contact BFS. We've got a very approachable team here, and they're very knowledgeable. And if something is not clear, give us a call. We're also always happy to talk about your forecasting needs and challenges, and to help you, guide you to a solution that's going to be most appropriate for you. And the last bullet here is important too, which is we want you to be happy and satisfied with your purchase. All versions of Forecast Pro come with a 30-day money-back guarantee, and basically, the best way to look to analyze whether this is going to work for you is actually to use it. So you can get the package, use it with your own data, take advantage of technical support if you need it, and make sure it works for you. And if it doesn't, send it back and for a full refund. So it's, again, we want to make sure that it's going to be the right tool for you. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have over 35,000 users. Our customer satisfaction is very high. And the product, it's a good product. If you need to generate statistical forecasts from historic demand, Forecast Pro is really a great solution. Okay, so I think that concludes our demonstration for today. I really want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and learning more about Forecast Pro. And again, if you have any questions, if you want a quotation, if you want to schedule a demonstration or anything like that, give us a call and talk to us. We're always happy to help.